right. Well, bienvenue à tous. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here with you all to have what we're calling a campfire discussion related to the potential for human missions that can fly by Venus, and whether or not this might present an opportunity to the international community for new science, new exploration, and new adventure. And to be clear, we're calling it a campfire discussion because we want to emulate the type of informal back and forth discussion that you might have around a campfire. In the US, you often go out in the summer and you have a campfire where you might play the guitar and you might share some thoughts about your hopes and your concerns about the future with each other. And we're hoping for that type of informal level of discussion. I will give a future disclaimer, but I want to be very clear. This is not a NASA briefing. This is not a NASA panel. This is to discuss an idea, a set of ideas that a few people have been developing related to a report that we will share. And we want to just have a discussion to hear from you all about what you think, whether you think this is a horrible idea, whether it is an interesting idea, whether it's an impractical idea, or whether it is the best idea you have ever heard. To help us with that discussion, we have Matt Duggan, who is from the Boeing Corporation, who has kindly agreed to moderate the campfire. I'm Alex McDonald. I am the chief economist at NASA, and I will be giving a short presentation about a report that was released yesterday. And we also have Spuds Vogel, who is our Director of Space Architectures at NASA headquarters, who will be here helping me take notes about this discussion, and will be there to interject if I go too far off the NASA headquarters script. With that as an introduction, this is the report that was released yesterday online by the Keck Institute for Space Studies at Caltech in Pasadena, California. You can see the link there. Matt was part of the team that helped produce it. And you can see that the report has been entitled provocatively, Meeting with the Goddess. Because, of course, in Western mythology and Greek mythology, the planet Venus is named after the goddess of love, Venus, Aphrodite. Although, of course, in many other cultures, the planet that we call Venus in the Western kind of world is sometimes a god of a different type. In Mesoamerican cultures, Quetzalcoatl is a warrior god who is associated with the planet Venus. But we think it's very striking that Venus, as the most visible planetary object in the sky, besides the moon and the sun, has been associated for thousands of years in human culture across the planet with the heavens, with specific gods. And so we thought provocatively this idea of going and flying by Venus was something like the meeting with the goddess in Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey book, which hopefully some of you are familiar with. These are notes from the first symposium that was held by the Keck Institute for Space Studies on Venus science that is enabled by human proximity. And we'll get into that here in a second. But the idea is that by having astronauts close to the planet Venus, whether flying by Venus on the way to Mars, flying by as a dedicated mission, or potentially even in orbit around Venus, that it may be possible to do interesting and new scientific investigations with people near Venus that you might not otherwise be able to do through robotic spacecraft alone. At the bottom of the page, you can see the clear disclaimer, and I want to be very clear that human missions to Venus are not part of the baseline exploration architecture of NASA or any of the other organizations that participate in the symposium. And missions to Venus are not part of NASA's current Moon to Mars objectives, which is another report that was released yesterday, although more than a report, really a whole list of our major objectives for our Moon to Mars program, which I very much encourage you all to read. Missions to Venus are not part of that. But I think there's some interesting correlations that I think it is worth exploring. And also, needless to say, the thoughts and concepts expressed and explored at the symposium that was held don't represent the positions of any of the participating organizations and are offered there, as they are here, in the spirit of open debate and discussion, as you would see around a campfire. So, with that said, these are some of the people and organizations that contributed to the study. Co-organizers were Noam Eisenberg from Johns Hopkins University APL, and then Mallory Lefland, who is from JPL. And you can see, in addition to Boeing, we had participants from Lockheed Martin, from SpaceX, from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Breakthrough Foundation, as well as Planetary Science Institute. So it was a very interesting conversation about people who are involved with Venus exploration in a lot of different ways, mostly robotically, but also people with the human factors side, because one of the reasons why human missions to Venus is very interesting is because they are much quicker and therefore may be much less risky than missions to Mars. So this was a provocative diary entry that was written by Dan Goods, who actually has one of the coolest jobs at JPL and in the entire space industry. He's essentially the art director for JPL. And so if you've seen the really cool space tourism posters, that was something that him and his team put together. Well, he put together this kind of introduction, which is an imagined diary entry from an astronaut on the first human mission to Venus. It's been dark for 6 months. Void of sky, void of landscape, void of family and friends. Being contained for what seems like forever with only points of light to ponder. The last thing I saw left me speechless. It was profound. The thin blue line that was the atmosphere of my home world getting smaller, until it disappeared into the vast field of stars. Earth had never meant so much to me. My people, my land, my home. Fragile in every sense of the word and seared into my memory banks as I and my crew approach the pale yellow dot. Venus, Earth's sister, who traveled a different path. One that left it inhospitable despite its similarities to home. What will our sister tell us about Earth, about ourselves, about the choices we have to make? What will being the first humans to ever see another planet up close do for those on this vessel and those waiting back home? We are 6 days out. It is dark, but the light is coming. This is meant to communicate something of the profound psychological impact that visiting any planet, Mars, Venus, Neptune if we ever get there, that it is going to have on us as people, and by proxy, on humanity as a whole. We know that we already had this type of experience when the astronauts in Apollo 8 took pictures of the moon up close and the Earth in the distance, the famous Earthrise photo. What will be the equivalent when we go to another planet? We don't know, but we know that going to any planet is likely to have a profound psychological impact. Now, you might think that this is a new idea, but if you've been around the space community for any length of time, you will know that there is almost no such thing as a new idea. You will know that usually whenever you think you've discovered some new concept, someone possibly as early as the late 19th century or the 1920s or the 1940s or 50s or 60s has already written a detailed treatise on the subject, because people have been thinking about spaceflight for that long. And human missions to Venus are no different. In the 1960s and the 1970s, when NASA was executing the Apollo program, one of the most common subjects of mission design was human missions to Venus. And I've put what I consider one of the most original early papers on that, which was one done by Edward Willis at the NASA Lewis Research Center, which today is now the Glenn Research Center outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And he wrote a technical memo, which he entitled Manned Venus Orbiting Mission. And he wrote it in 1967, before we conducted the Apollo 8 mission. And he concluded that a Venus mission can be accomplished using Apollo-level technology and argued to include it in the Apollo application program, which ultimately produced Skylab. And so in the years after that, NASA commissioned 2 series of studies called the Empire and the Umpire studies. And I'll see if I can remember the acronym. I believe Empire stood for Early Manned Interplanetary Missions. Anyways, they were concept studies about early planetary mission design. And Umpire did similar. And these were studies that looked at nuclear propulsion options, chemical propulsion options to both Venus and Mars. But importantly, in those studies, Venus was just as commonly and often more commonly selected for study because it was recognized to be by far the easiest planetary object other than the moon that you could get to with very basic levels of technology, including the Apollo levels of technology. And so this is something that has recently come back into the equation as we get more and more serious about deep space exploration. So as a brief reminder as to why human missions to Venus are much easier, this is your distance chart. So at the very top you have the distance between the Earth and the Moon, and there you can see in the ones below both the average distance from Earth to Venus and Earth to Mars, and the maximum distance from Earth to Venus and Earth to Mars. And you can see Venus is pretty regularly much, much, much closer. And that's how the chief economist gets involved, because when something is very close and it is easier to get to, that usually means it's much, much cheaper. And if you're an economist, you're interested in how might we get to another planet cheapest and quickest. It seems it's possible that Venus might be a place that we can get to in a relatively short period of time. The way in which Venus got kind of onto the radar, again, in terms of design studies at NASA, and I want to be very clear, this is still all just study stuff, was most recently in 2019, when at the time, the NASA administrator at the time essentially announced that we were targeting an opposition class mission with a short stay on Mars. As you'll have seen if you've been updating the Moon to Mars objectives, we no longer necessarily believe that it's going to be an opposition class mission. We're still looking at short stays, but we're also still continuing to interrogate that, because what we're really working to now are objectives that have been laid out in the most recent Moon to Mars objectives report. As I said, that was released yesterday. But at the time, we were looking at these opposition class missions. And when you do opposition class missions, as the Empire and the Umpire studies revealed, you not only get human missions to Venus for free, they actually can give you a delta V boost. It's not on every single launch window, but about half of the launch windows on opposition class mission trajectories, you want to fly by Venus if you can, because it reduces your overall delta V needs that you need to provide in terms of propulsion. And this is a sample of that type of mission trajectory. That is essentially an opposition class mission, Earth, Mars, Venus, Mars, where you fly by Venus on the way back. And there's a lot of different technical parameters that I'm sure all of you are actually much more familiar with working than I am. I'm a very simple-minded economist. So I tend to focus on one number in this chart and the following, which is the total number of days. Total number of days for this mission looks to be about 738 days. So you're looking at roughly 2 years. And for those of you who are familiar with Mars architecture designs, you'll know that this is the quick version. There are longer versions of this in conjunction class missions, which can take around 3 years. It's a lot of time. For those of you who are familiar, we only have about a year plus worth of experience in microgravity on space stations, both Mir and the ISS. So extending mission duration up to 2 years in microgravity, and for the first time truly in deep space beyond the Earth-Moon system, a lot of challenge with that. There's a lot of risk, a lot of cost. And so it's also worth knowing that there are other options, and these have been revealed in numerous studies online that you can also find reference in the report. You can also just fly by Venus. You can take a dedicated mission and fly by Venus in, as the chart shows, basically 1 year. And for me, that's one of the most interesting things about the potential for human missions to Venus, whether a government agency does it or whether a private sector organization does it. At some point in the development of our deep space exploration capabilities, it will become increasingly clear that you can do one-year missions to Venus and back. You just fly by. But there may be interesting things you can do when you fly by. More on that in a second. This, however, was the, I would say, single most interesting thing that was discovered by the symposium that was held by the Keck Institute for Space Studies. And this is the idea of doing a double flyby. So one of the people who we had at the symposium was a JPL engineer named Mark Wallace. And Mark Wallace does a lot of the trajectory design for JPL. And within standard robotic exploration trajectory work, there is something you can do called a pi transfer. The pi transfer is basically used to transition using gravitational slingshots from one orbit to another, and they're most commonly used when Cassini has been doing the exploration of the moons. You use a pi transfer to go by a moon, get a delta V kick to then go on to another orbit to try to fly by another moon, etc. Well, it is not commonly applied, this technique, to human spaceflight missions. And so we did this to a human flyby Venus. And what resulted was a very interesting concept, which is basically Venus double flyby, which we're calling the Venus backflip. And the Venus backflip concept, which again, Mark Wallace gets full credit for here, this would have you go out to Venus, you'd backflip up out of the ecliptic by about 0.1 AU, follow Venus around in its orbit for about 100 days, come back down, another flyby of Venus on the way back home to Earth. The trajectory that we're describing here has no additional propulsive burns, although additional propulsive burns would allow you to have a return to Earth that was a little less spicy on the return entry velocity. Again, even though this has a double flyby in about 100 days over one of the poles of Venus, it is still a relatively short mission, still only about 565 days. As I said, I think this is the first time that this mission concept has been discussed publicly, and it's a pretty interesting one. And for those of you who are trying to visualize what that looks like around Venus, this is coming into Venus. Obviously, in 3 dimensions, that's it popping out of the ecliptic there before coming back down and getting another flyby around Venus. So, what would you do if you were just flying by Venus? What would you do from a science perspective? Well, there's actually a lot of different things that you could look at. Perhaps the one that has the scientists that were part of the symposium most excited was the idea of real-time operation of some of these robotic assets. Venus is not something we are going to be landing on anytime soon. And you're probably not even going into the atmosphere with humans anytime soon either. But if you're flying by, you have much less latency between you and any robotic assets that are either on Venus or in the atmosphere. And in addition, crewed spacecraft often have a lot of high volume of bandwidth. So you can potentially use the fact that you have humans around this planet to have a more diverse and aggressive teleoperation strategy for your robotic assets. So what would you do with that? Well, obviously, you would do some atmospheric exploration. You would be able to joystick drones in the atmosphere. You might even be able to joystick atmospheric skimming devices if you are thinking you can do an atmospheric sample return. You also are able to joystick robotic rovers on the surface. And one of the other interesting things that came up at the symposium was that it turns out the highest volcano on Venus is Maxwell Montes, which is something that actually may be one of the best environments to land a robotic probe because it's much less high pressure, it's cooler, and so a robot there might be able to last longer. As some of you may know, the robotic probes that have landed on Venus in the past tended to last for like 1 or 2 days, and it took the Soviet space program numerous attempts at landing to even get them to last that long. So robotic exploration of the surface is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And so any sort of robotic spacecraft that you're liable to have there is likely not going to have much time, which means that latency, having real-time operation, could be a significant help. So these are some of the science endeavors that having humans in proximity to Venus might help. And so that's pretty much it from the perspective of the report. At this point, I'm now mostly interested in hearing from what you all think about all this. Obviously, you can probably tell that I personally think this is quite interesting. I hope some of you will read the report, but I am now going to sit down and try to answer as few questions as possible. I hope each of you will answer each other's questions as part of a campfire discussion. And so with that, I am now happy to turn it over to Matt, who will help moderate this discussion. I think we have microphones up front, but also in the interest of campfire discussion, I think you can feel free to shout out unless Matt tells you otherwise. So with that, thank you. I look forward to hearing what you think.
So thank you, Alex. And as Alex said, this isn't a plan. This isn't a definitive roadmap. This is the inkling of an idea, the beginning of an idea, and we are genuinely here asking for what you think of the trajectories, what you think of the science that can be done at Venus, what you think of any part of this. We're trying to expand our horizon as much as possible. We'll continue to think about this, but we recognize that what we have started here is just our own ideas at this point, and we're anxious to hear what everyone else has to say. So, as he said, please feel free to ask a question, but even more, just give us your ideas, what you have to say. And this is the difficult part where someone goes first. So, are you volunteering? Go ahead. Excellent. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Rob Coppinger from Spaceflight Magazine. So if you can get there in a year, and if you can get there and back in a year, why hasn't NASA considered this for a sort of test run, sort of the actual ship that'll go out to Mars, or at least first version?
So,
I can speak to that. So just like the disclaimer, the question was, has this been, why wasn't this considered? I've been talking to Alex about this for a little bit. Again, Spuds Vogel, Director of Space Architecture at NASA. And one of the things, I'm relatively new to NASA, and if you saw the Moon to Mars objectives that we came out, that we published the refined version of those objectives yesterday, this wasn't something that just started in the last year. This has been, the whole going back to the moon and on to Mars has been something that has just been discussed, seriously for 33 years, from President Bush 41 forward with the Space Exploration Initiative. The idea, and as I understand, the idea of doing Venusian flybys and missions like that, those seeds have been planted from time to time, but they've been planted, and then it sort of goes dormant, and then it gets planted again, and then it goes dormant. I think this is one of those moments where it's, okay, the seed's getting planted, and what we're doing here is seeing, are we watering that plant? Is it going to bloom? Is there interest in it? And so what I would say is it was never, I don't think it was baked in to the Moon to Mars program, because that's not something that plant had not been watered, if you'll forgive the parlance. That just hasn't been part of the equation. Having said that, since I got the mic real quick, I will say also that my 2 cents on this would be, if you're going to go down this path, we would have to follow a very similar process that produced those moon to Mars objectives. You start with asking yourselves why. Now, I would imagine that why Venn diagram, there's going to be a subset of that probably applies here as well. But then as soon as you've done that, you have to start asking yourselves, you plant that seed and say, okay, is there something here? What do we accomplish there? And by the way, one last thing is the Moon to Mars objectives and why. The answer to the question we're asking of why is, why send humans? right? Why are we sending humans into deep space? So in this case, I would ask the same question. Ask ourselves, why do this with humans? What would be the value there? I don't have an answer for it. I'm just saying that would be how I'd start the conversation.
Thank you. Okay, who has the next question? Oh,
Stand up here. Hey, this is a very insightful presentation. My name is Cole Watts, and it's more of a comment and potential collaboration. We're in this time period with our team about a name change from Mars University to Multi-Planet University. And it gets really interesting, and there's a lot of variables, and Venus is really on the horizon, I think, for a lot of us. And I've got I don't know, however many years dedicated towards supporting Venetian research and education with our team, and we're planning to host this Venus Science and Engineering certificate program next summer with Humans to Venus, and Dr. Jeffrey Landis, tentative and potential, but focus on the past, present, and future of systems and life, and really enabling these habitable environments in the clouds. And we'd much appreciate exploring collaboration with you guys and NASA and the Venus Exploration Group. So just look forward to hearing.
thank you. Yeah, that is something we also discussed at the symposium, of the outreach aspect of that, and we are actively looking for anyone who wants to have the discussion and cooperate with us, and Alex has already copied down the details there. I saw him getting it, so excellent. Thank you for that. Let's go back here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Have you got the speed of re-entry at the end of the mission for the two scenarios? The re-entry speed, and it is compatible with Orion technology, for example?
So as I said, this is for a free return trajectory,
Yes.
15 kilometers per second. As I said, spicy.
Yes, it's approximately the same that Mars return. Perfect, thank you.
Spicy is code word for well above any velocity that has been achieved thus far. So there are ways around that if you introduce a burn on the way back to slow your re-entry velocity, but there's a lot of work to be done there. Sure. Oh, okay, we're doing that.
Right. You show a maneuver around Venus which keeps you in the vicinity of Venus. Is there a delta V associated with that maneuver? And if not, what additional delta V would be needed to actually go into a highly elliptical orbit rather than come straight back?
So there is no delta V associated with that maneuver itself. That's one of the unique things about it. You can just do the flyby, you go up and then come back and head on your way. It is quite a large delta V, though, to get into orbit beyond that. It's going to be at least, well, several thousand or 2,000 kilometers, not kilometers, meters per second.
It's just having gone all that way, it seems if it's only a small delta V, why not stay there a little bit longer? But
well,
it would take a lot of fuel, would it?
The delta V to do that would be a significant percentage of the delta V you've already gotten there. So it's not just a little extra step. And I think that's one of the things that's dangerously seductive about either talking about going to Mars or going to Venus, right? It seems like I've gone all the way there in terms of distance, and now I just should just do this extra thing. But actually, in terms of mission complexity and mission risk,
But-
the mass you need to do it, you add a whole bunch by having to go into orbit and certainly go
But
down.
you could drop off small orbiters, presumably.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be ideal, drop-off orbiters or even non-orbiters that go into the atmosphere and take data there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there-
Thank you. More of a short comment, but to me it seems to make a lot of sense at the moment as a lot of technology is being developed for long duration missions to use it because, or like to develop it further for a mission like this because Venus is so hostile in such an extreme way that, I mean, it'll take decades to develop any kind of technology where humans can land on Venus and actually do something there. So it seems like the right time to use the technology that's being developed for this long duration mission to Mars for a long duration mission for Venus.
Yes, I agree. One thing that we did discuss at the symposium is how the fact that humans will not be walking on the surface of Venus anytime soon does take the pressure off in a way to achieve that. And so that may help the Venus goal. Is there another? We'll go next here.
Hi, I'm Brian Barnett with Solstar, and good job, Alex. Interesting. I haven't thought about sending humans to Venus, I don't know if ever, because of the fact that we all figured out how bad of a, how extreme of a place it is with sulfuric acid and the pressures and everything. But I would support, I would support going there like on the way to Mars. I think that's a good idea. I would definitely be in favor of that. But of course, like I said, I haven't even thought about sending humans around Venus for. I don't know. It's a since it's a sister planet and so forth. I'm sure there would be some really cool reasons for going there. So at least you have this one American's vote, I guess, in favor.
Thank you.
I wanted to circle back to humans. Why humans? And as economists and as explorers, in my opinion, it's been throughout the history of humanity. When we set a target for us to explore some area, and as long as we want to achieve that as a goal, as a target, then some way we will come, and it may not necessarily be the way that we envision now, but it will be a driver for developing new technologies and new methodologies. So with that's why humans, because we are, with the robotic technology or non-human presence, we become a little bit more settled and comfortable, and it's somewhere, so it takes, so what if it takes 3 years to reach Mars or whatever other planet we decide to explore? But when humans, and when we have that target, when we have that goal, we try to get to that goal. And even if it's a little later or more later, it will still be then achievable. That's why humans.
Thank you. Yeah, the human in the loop it definitely adds to the whole equation, and having a human nearby who can make real-time decisions rather than a pre-programmed robot adds so many dimensions to the possibilities.
Yeah, just to follow up on the comment, I fully agree that the surface of Venus is very inhospitable, but floating in the atmosphere, you're in a 1G environment, possibly at a pressure of close to 1 atmosphere. Okay, it's an acidic, possibly, environment, but that would be a far more hospitable location for a human presence. Any comments on that?
Yeah. Agreed.
So I would have two questions. The first one, is there some like, I don't know, let's go to Venus forum, something like this, that like to pump the water for the seed? Because there seems to be a lot of interest, but maybe we need like some, I don't know, somewhere where we can get together. I have no idea for that, but if someone maybe already knows something like this, maybe somebody knows about this. And yeah, the second one, if someone here knows more about those atmospheric probes during the flyby, I think that's really interesting. So if someone wants to elaborate on that and maybe share his knowledge, that would be really cool.
So on the first question, are you talking about continuing interest here on Earth?
Sorry?
For your first question, are you talking about an interest group here on Earth that will continue?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. I'm going to hand the mic to Alex and talk about maybe next August.
Great question, and appreciate the comment. In the report, there's actually a whole chapter on the question of social organizations related to considering and promoting human missions to Venus. I think everyone here in the community is very familiar with the role of these types of societies for Mars, for Moon, and many other types of destinations. And so one of the questions that was raised at the symposium is the same one that you raised. And the interest was significant amongst the members of the symposium, so significant that in fact one of the participants volunteered to sponsor such a meeting next year. I was going to save this for the end, but since you're already 3 steps ahead, we might as well get there. Pete Warden, who runs the Breakthrough Prize Foundation, he was a participant at the meeting, and they are one of the sponsors of potentially robotic, privately funded missions to the atmospheres of Venus, because they're interested in potentially looking for life in the clouds. So he offered to host and sponsor a meeting in Luxembourg on August 13th, 2023. Why August 13th, 2023? Well, August 13th, 2023 is what is known as the Venus Inferior Conjunction, which is when Venus is closest to Earth. And it gets so close, it's actually only about 100 times the distance of the Earth to the Moon. And that happens every 1.5 years. And every 105 years to 121 years or so, that particular day is when we can experience transits of Venus. And so people very much resonate with the idea. Everyone will be invited to Luxembourg. Who knows what's going to be there, because no planning has been made yet. But if enough people from the space community interested in Venus show up in Luxembourg on August 13th, 2023, it'll probably be an interesting party. So yes, and I'm glad to hear that you're interested.
Thanks.
And then the second part of your question was about the atmospheric probes. And I'll say that at our symposium, we know the existence of those, but we don't know much about them. So I actually, right there, let me invite anyone in the room who has any knowledge of that to share on what has happened there to date. I know there have been many papers, there have been many ideas, but can anyone help? Not yet. Okay. Well, then let's go to the next question. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anushka. I'm from Nort. I wonder if there are any ethical considerations of the Venetian atmosphere, particularly because of the prospect of potential life in the clouds, and what part that might play in space exploration and just our ethical considerations of going to Venus. More of a question.
I'll take a shot at it if no one else is going to speak up. But yes, obviously, those are the concerns. And I think that many of the same people who are considering that now for Mars would be involved in that kind of discussion for Venus, because obviously you don't want to go there and mess things up too much.
Thank you. So when you translate such a proposal, such an idea into a program proposal, it feels like you always have to compete with other projects within a specific mission directorate, I think it's called within SR, among the different things. So, Alex, I know you're an economist, so how can you demonstrate that something like this can compete on socio-economic terms with other things, or is it completely different rationale that is being put forward for some concept like this?
So I would say this doesn't compete. A, because it's a concept. It's a concept that's been known for many, many years. But more fundamentally, as an economist, the way I see it is this. There are various entities, government programs, private companies, who are able to generate their program plans. But at the end of the day, private entities, individual humans, are the ones who create the motive force for all of that demand. And eventually, here we sit in 2022, our deep space exploration capabilities are not all that advanced in that we don't have any that take humans yet. But 30 years in the future, 40 years in the future, I think we all expect that they will exist. And so I generally don't think about it as a competition. This is a concept that exists for humans to explore, and my conclusion is that because it is close and relatively easy, at some point, provided that we all survive another 50 years, some humans will choose to do this. Who does it, when they do it, that's a different question.
Thank you.
Can I talk? All right. I was reflecting, and then I did the research. I was reading a lot about the Artemis program, the Mars program, and then there's the Venus, and then how far are we pushing the humanity to go to outer? Are we pushing a lot, or I don't know. I feel like, okay, let's go to the space. Let's go and research in outer space. We say a lot on this topic. Can you hear me now? Okay. I was thinking, I was reflecting, how far are we pushing the humanity to humans to go to outer planet? We know that with the Mars mission, the Artemis NASA mission, we have a lot of knowledge gap. The knowledge gap for living in the space, outer planet. So how are we pushing this? We don't know. And then isn't it pushing too much to humans to go, let's go to the space? I'm just questioning.
Well, I think that's a great question, and I'll give a short answer, and then I would love to hear what anyone else thinks about this. Personally, I think there's just something innate in humans to go pushing beyond and go do things that may seem a little stupid to other people, but that is the entire history of humanity, just going over that next hill and seeing what's on the other side. And we've been over all the hills on Earth now, so we're going to push out. So we're not ready. We don't have all the technology we need to go to Mars right now. I don't think you disagree with me, but we're going to find it, and we'll get there. And that's just part of our, in our core as humans, to just go and do these things, just if for no other reason, just for the sake of doing them.
I want to just turn around. There's a really good book by a guy called Professor Chris Mason, which I recommend. It's called Engineering Life, The Next 500 Years to Reach New Worlds. And he's so awesome because he talks about the intersection of genomics, technology, and where we're going, and the opportunities over the next 500 years. So I don't know if Jim Green from NASA is in the room, but on Clubhouse we discuss this quite a lot, and how in the future, basically the book sums up and says that we're the only civilization in our known kind of like civilization in our solar system that not only understands our uniqueness in our place, but also all of the animals that are on this planet and spaceship with us, right? So if we were to think about moving to another place in the universe or somewhere else in our solar system in the future, at some point, the sun's solar energy is going to run out, right? We're about to go into a portion of the the galaxy, where there are many more near Earth orbiting objects that are also a threat. So we have to start thinking about other places that we might not have considered, which is why I think it could be Venus as an option for something, because I think Jim Green does say that we don't know whether Mars is our future or our past, and we don't know whether Venus is our future or our past. And I think, my voice is shaking because of the adrenaline of talking, but I think these are the important considerations, because it's a very human, intrinsic thing, like you say, to think about how we're connecting the dots of empowering each other to use technology to propel ourselves forward. But ultimately, we shouldn't leave anyone behind, right? The technology we're using for space exploration should be used to propel every single human on our planet Earth. That's my thoughts. I'm going to hide now.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry, can you use the microphone?
Is that Jim Green from NASA? Oh. No. Oh, okay. Okay, I found him. He taught us in the ICU.
So just a quick question, adding on what you were saying in terms of the type of civilization that we want to be and looking ahead into the future, and also about energy consumption and how we look at celestial bodies. This might be quite controversial, but it's a topic that's under discussion. How we look at celestial bodies to conserve and to deploy, to generate energy and other resources. And I think that although it's controversial, is an important discussion to be had. So Venus, going to Venus and going to other celestial bodies is really epitomizing the type of civilization that we will become. Type 1 or type 2 civilizations, and it might take 500,000 of years to get there, but I suppose these are the first steps towards that, realizing that. It's just sort of just a statement. Maybe the question is around energy and the future of trying to use energy in this way, from solar energy out in space as well as celestial bodies, if you know anything.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lord Bentel from SGAC. For me, I'm wondering if with improving a private space industry and the space sector, that could help maybe accelerate our presence around, for a mission like going to Venus. We can see for Artemis already, there's a lot of activity from private space companies to try and help improve the, convenience of staying on the moon. I'm wondering maybe along this timeline, there is a branch of where we look at Venus and realize that it's actually much easier to maybe live around in orbit around it and do more experiments. I think the private space companies may simplify things with the growth that we are seeing. I don't know, I can't say a specific timeline, but I guess maybe, I don't know, so I think for me, I'll say the private space sector may have a strong contribution to this particular area.
Thank you. I'll say, purely as an engineer who's not associated with NASA or their roadmap, Venus is easier to get to in some ways, and there's an attractiveness there when you look at it purely in that form, and that may drive some of that economic interest that Alex was referring to, and the private companies coming in and finding their own reasons for doing this beyond.
So I'm Ralph McNutt from APL, and I got involved with a little bit of this early on. I remember reading in a news magazine when I was, this was in 1962, but it was new, and I was newer, about we'd have a manned flight in orbit around Venus by 1967. Well, that didn't quite work out. But, I would suggest that, and I think this was sort of touched upon, that, I think that this whole idea of Venus and Mars and the moon are all really one part of an exploration ecosystem. And I think aspirationally, everybody would agree that the target is Mars. And so the question, I think, really is and it's been remarked upon that it's easier to get to Venus. And so I think the real question is Venus, getting by Venus, is this a way of reducing the risk of eventually successfully getting to Mars in the same way that building up some of the infrastructure now and looking at some of the things we need to do to learn to live on the moon is also a kind of risk reduction for getting to Mars. And I would suggest that actually that the Venus thing sort of got left out a long time ago because all of these things are hard to do. But nonetheless, as we get to be thinking very seriously, really seriously about actually going to Mars, I think that the time has come to rethink whether that going by Venus and maybe doing some science on the way, but going by Venus as a risk reduction as part of getting to Mars is maybe the way to be starting to think about this for the first time in quite a few years.
I agree. So again, it's only been about a year, but I'd heard that in the halls at NASA. But I will say this: as soon as you get from that veneer comment, start scratching. As I start to go down a little bit, there's not a lot of depth there. Other than that is an idea, and it doesn't go. And I'm talking about. It's not a. I don't mean that as a negative. It's just things like, well, you say it's risk reduction, but for example, the radiation environment's going to be different. The solution space that you come up with to do Venus, there's going to be elements on the technology side that you're going to have to do differently to do Venus, right? And are there answers for that yet? Maybe in pockets here and there, but it gets back to my seed comment. A seed gets planted, doesn't get watered, goes dormant. 5 years, 10 years go by, someone brings it up again, right? I think that's a cycle that has gone on a little bit. So this is a potential of, are we in that cycle now? Is this one of those, we're going to talk about it here today, and then we're going to hear about it again, and we're going to do it again in 6 years or 10 years? Or we need to actually ask ourselves the technology, go another layer deep before we can get serious about it, to be honest with you, right? Let's have some answers and ask ourselves some tougher technical questions of what does it take to pull that off, so that when someone does want to entertain this a little bit more and they ask those questions, they don't hit a dry well. That's what I would say, sitting where I'm at.
Yeah, that was a great conversation, and I just want everyone to know Ralph McNutt has been doing this work on this subject for many decades, and Noam and myself, when we were kind of starting on this journey, we were reading his papers as well. So I just want everyone to know, since this is a campfire feel, we've got one of the wise elders here from the campfire. So thanks, Ralph, for showing up.
And then just to keep up with the spicy theme a little bit, I'm going to not disagree, but make a counterpoint to what my co-panel member just said, and said to think about, most of the trajectories that go to Mars from Earth go inside Earth's orbit. They go closer to the sun, and some of them as near as Venus's orbit. So you're already buying into designing a spacecraft that can survive at that distance from the sun, and you're committing to putting humans in that location. So I think there's a lot of room for discussion there to figure out where it all goes together.
It could have been a bad example, but it's one of those technical
Yes.
exploration of that. I think it's just the technical exploration. It has to get beyond idea. It's got to, if you're going to do it, and I think that's not going to, well, I guess it could happen organically, but it's going to start with conversations like this. People go away, they start thinking about it, and then they have answers prepared in the future when those come up, whatever the technical topic is.
So I think we did a pretty good job of putting off the inevitable discussion among ourselves here. So yay for us. But next question here? Oh, sorry, already over there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm from MIT, so I have a question and a comment. On the sort of idea of, does it fit along this path to Mars? I feel like the question of, does the moon naturally fit along that path, for a lot of us who are maybe entering the industry, is still quite unanswered, because that is a different case again, right? Your EDL is different, your radiation environment is still a little different, you don't have the same communication. So I feel like the Venus case, if we, we typically are quite incremental in space, it's that one step beyond the moon but not quite at Mars, I feel is fairly legitimate in terms of, I work in a human-focused lab, so ECLES and keeping someone alive for that long without Earth resupply is a very big concern for a 3-year mission, and a 1-year mission seems a lot more doable. But on the question of watering the seeds, do you think, from my sort of inexperienced view, interest in Mars with the general public seems to peak whenever there's interesting scientific discoveries there from our rovers and our landers. And at the moment, sort of interest is very high because of Perseverance and Ingenuity. Do you think with the increase in all of the Venus planned missions, the Da Vinci mission, MIT and Rocket Lab are planning a quite cheap mission there, do you think maybe that can water those seeds? Or could private industry be an aid the way that Peter Beck at Rocket Labs is trying to be?
Yeah, so that was explicitly discussed at the symposium, and our co-organizer, Noam Eisenberg, came up with a kind of portmanteau where he spells Venus with a 3 for the E, because there are 3 missions all going at the end of the decade, right? Veritas, Da Vinci, and then the private mission. Right? Oh, sorry, Envision. Envision's the 3rd one, and then potentially there's a 4th with a private mission. And there was discussion about the fact that this is going to focus the minds of the world on Venus in a way that it really hasn't been, you could maybe argue, since Magellan, or maybe even since the early Mariners, if you want to really go back. And that's a real opportunity. That already baked into the next 10 years is a more extensive robotic scientific campaign at Venus than we have seen for decades. And that will inherently focus attention on Venus, and that I would just say simply creates an opportunity. What we do with that opportunity is up to all of us in the room, and what we do outside of this room as well. So, but I think you're exactly right to identify that opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Richard. I'm coming from the preclinical world, studying radiobiological effects. And so I'm just curious, commenting on your remark about the change in the radiation environment. I mean, a lot of funding goes to the idea that we will go to Mars, and so experiments are designed with the type of radiation and the amount of radiation that they are expected to be exposed to. And so I'm just curious how much has been investigated what a Venus flyby would look like in terms of effects on electronics, on human health, etc.
Yeah, I'll have to say for us that I don't know, and we have not talked about that. But those are excellent questions. And at least for the radiation point of view, we've talked about generally, not at the kind of detailed knowledge you would want, but once you leave the Earth's magnetic field, we have to solve that for humans one way or another, whether you're going to Mars, whether you're going to Venus, whether you're going anywhere. So there's an assumption that we'll get there, but it's all in that boat. That definitely a problem that needs to be hammered flat before we put humans in that situation.
So in the report, there is a discussion of the trade-off between your GCR, right, and any solar proton radiation. Obviously, as you go closer into the sun, solar proton, potential solar flare risks go up. But since the mission is much less in terms of time duration, your GCR goes down significantly. And generally, GCR, as I'm sure you're aware, is considered one of the most significant persistent health risks of deep space travel. So the timing function has a direct correlation to this core health and human performance variable, which is GCR radiation. And being much quicker and a much shorter mission helps you quite a bit on that.
Maybe we should write a grant together.
Yeah. And of course, from my engineering perspective, SPE is at least somewhat more predictable or measurable and more shieldable. So I'd rather try and protect a human from that than GCR at this point. Next.
So slightly away from the flyby idea, thinking about the future again and thinking about making space accessible, more accessible to humans, I suppose it might be necessary to have some sort of bases around planetary bodies to make access easier. And I don't know anything about this topic, but do we know anything about being able to, put some sort of base in orbit to be able to create these kind of space highways, not highways, but so that you can get to other planetary bodies with more ease? And this might be after the flyby, but.
So there's one study that NASA did many years ago that's worth looking at in terms of kind of longer duration in the atmosphere of Venus, which is called the Havoc Study. And Havoc was a particular design study for essentially a inflatable airship that would go around in the Venus atmosphere. So there have been studies on that. You can see that online. There are studies that have been published in videos. Again, I look at things like that in the videos as an economist, and they just still seem very expensive. And so I tend to think always in terms of what is the cheapest minimum viable product. But there's an extensive discussion about that, obviously in kind of the design literature, but also in the science fiction literature. One of the things that we haven't discussed, but in terms of kind of the visions that people have kind of had for what could happen around Venus, people have been writing about human exploration, missions to Venus for literally over 100 years. In fact, one of the things I learned was that George R.R. Martin, the guy who wrote Game of Thrones, recently edited a whole collection on old Venus narratives because it still has this resonance through the years. So I think it's very interesting that we keep returning to this vision of a multi-planetary species, not just kind of one or two destinations. And when we think about these extended infrastructures, how long it takes us to get there, TBD, but it's still very much part of our zeitgeist, and as I said, has been literally part of our zeitgeist for 100 years. We're part of a century-long conversation on that exact subject at this point.
Let's do one more question. Do we have one last one? Can we go over here first?
Hi, I'm Siddharth Dikshit, student at TU Delft. So I'm a student, so I don't have much expertise in this. But so I was wondering, so looking at the flyby plot you had, it reminded me quite a bit about like the halo orbits around the moon right now. So I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit more delta V and enter some kind of halo orbit around Venus, would you be able to then also get the benefits of staying close to Venus, but then also have the choice of perhaps leaving at a later date?
The answer is yes. And there's a lot of interesting trajectories out there, and one thing that wasn't done in the study we've done so far is the low energy type trajectories that you're mentioning there. Those could be very provocative perhaps there, but we just don't know at this point. We've not looked into that. I'll say that we have talked about the benefit of the free return trajectory though, where you're not going into an orbit, which means you don't have to come out of the orbit. And that may be a beneficial first mission just because you're minimizing the risk that you can. All right, one last question over here, if we could, and then we will wrap this up.
Yes, and I think this is a suitable wrap-up question. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Peter Robinson. I'm with the British Interplanetary Society. This is an very interesting interplanetary mission. You mentioned there'll be potentially a discussion in August in Luxembourg. Will there be another opportunity to continue this discussion before then? Is anything planned?
There is nothing currently planned, although I would note that there are already bodies that convene that discuss these types of issues. So, for example, the Venus Exploration Analysis Group, VEXAG, I believe they're having their meeting in November. And while there have not traditionally been a lot of people interested in human spaceflight who've attended that, to my knowledge, there is nothing stopping you from registering. So that's one place. But in all honesty, you know, the group that convened around this convened in part because of a recognition that there aren't enough places to have these conversations. So to be honest, the next one planned really is this one in August, but you know, you're welcome to host a related discussion on your own British Interplanetary Society offices, which I have been to in London, by the way.
Okay, I'll mention it to the leadership.
Excellent. So I think that's about all the time we have today. Thanks to both of you for helping with the campfire. I am just personally very grateful for you all for being here, warming yourself around the concept of human missions to Venus, sharing your thoughts. And it is really an exciting time to be having this conversation. Certainly I'll be around outside for anyone who wants to come up and continue the conversation. But just thank you very, very deeply for your thoughts and for your hopes. And please, yes, check out the report. You can look at the Keck Institute for Space Studies website. Google it. It's on the front page right now. And beyond that, I hope to see you all in Luxembourg in 2023. All right, thanks.